Son, you know the tale of the Deerfield massacre, but you know little of our family's part that night. We have some hours yet before we reach Deerfield, so I shall tell you the grim tale of what our cousins endured that awful night. Our Catlin kin first came from England during the Great Migration to Massachusetts. There were two men, John and Thomas Catlin. Whether they were brothers or cousins, none recall, but they were near of an age, and our families have always reckoned themselves kin. John came into Connecticut not long after Reverend Hooker led his people west from Massachusetts and founded Hartford. The Pequot War followed soon after, with grievous sins committed by both Christian and heathen, before peace returned to the valley. John settled at Wethersfield, a few miles downriver, and within a few years Thomas followed and made his home at Hartford. Your great-grandfather John was soon born to Thomas in Hartford. In due time, John married your great-grandmother Mary Marshall, and the Lord blessed them with a growing family. Among their children was your grandfather Samuel. Thomas's cousin John Catlin soon married Isabel Ward, and they settled at Wethersfield, where their son John was born. But the elder John died while the boy was still an infant, and Isabel afterward married Joseph Baldwin. Young John was raised in their household, and in time would make a family of his own. His stepfather ensured that John received an impressive education. John grew to manhood and married his stepsister Mary Baldwin round about 1662. Their daughter Mary was born while they were still in Connecticut, but by 1667, opportunity had drawn the young family south to New Jersey. John was hired as the town's schoolmaster and also acted as the city attorney, as well as serving as selectman. There they raised a growing family, including Hannah, Elizabeth, Esther, Sarah, Joseph, and Jonathan. Round about 10 years later, King Philip's War descended upon New England as if sent by the devil himself. It was unlike anything New England had yet endured. For more than a year, fighting swept from settlement to settlement, as English militia and Indian war parties struck at one another with terrible fury. Entire towns went up in flames. Farms and fields were laid waste. Families fled to the safety of larger settlements, and men on both sides answered vengeance with vengeance in kind. You dare not dwell on particulars. Over 100 settlements were attacked, with more than a dozen of these burned to the ground. Deerfield, up the Connecticut River from Hartford, was among the villages wiped out. When the war ended, Deerfield lay empty. Most who had held land there were dead, while others had no stomach to remain on the dangerous frontier. Their heirs were left with property few men wanted, and land could be bought for a fraction of what a good farm farther south might cost. For a man with a large family and no land of his own, ruined Deerfield offered something difficult to find elsewhere: opportunity. In 1683, John gathered his family and left Newark for Deerfield. With 7 children, livestock, tools, bedding, provisions, and everything they could carry, it was no small undertaking. There were few proper roads to follow, and much of the journey north had to be made along rough tracks through the wilderness. What could not ride in a cart was carried on horseback or driven along on foot. At the end of that long journey waited a settlement still being rebuilt from the last ruin. But there was good land to be had, and John had sons and daughters whose futures he must provide for. In Deerfield, the Catlins would have land enough to put down roots of their own. The labor was never-ending: planting, harvesting, and clearing the land. It was hard work, but a man could call the land his own. The village itself quickly found its footing. New families arrived, children were born, and neighbors depended greatly upon one another. The older children grew to adulthood. Mary had married Thomas French, while Elizabeth had married James Corse. Their families began to grow in Deerfield. Hannah also married, but moved downriver a piece to Northampton. Mary soon gave birth to John Jr. John and his eldest boys mustered with the local militia, as was both custom and law. As only a handful of years had passed since Deerfield had been destroyed, There were no illusions of the consequences of a lapse in vigilance. The peace did not long last. 6 years after John's family had settled Deerfield, the kingdoms of England and France were at war once more, and before long their quarrel reached these colonies. Here in New England, we called it King William's War. Though most of the fighting lay far away in Maine and Nova Scotia, those who lived upon the frontier knew better than to trust in distance for their safety. In the summer of 1694, militia scouts brought warning that French soldiers and native warriors were approaching Deerfield. The alarm was sounded, and the militia gathered to meet them. The raiders found no frightened settlement waiting to be taken, but armed men ready to defend their stockaded homes. After several sharp exchanges, the attackers withdrew to seek easier prey. 2 of Deerfield's people were killed, and 2 carried away captive. But by God's grace the village stood, and the enemy had been turned away. Deerfield avoided the fate it had suffered a generation ago. When peace returned in 1697, the people of Deerfield had good cause to give thanks. They had faced the enemy and held their ground. Their militia had proved its worth, their homes and fields remained their own, and it seemed the Lord had favored their perseverance. After scarcely 5 years of peace, England and France were at crossed swords once more. This time it came to be called Queen Anne's War. Yet the people of Deerfield did not abandon their homes. They had faced war before and endured. They trusted their neighbors, trusted their militia, and perhaps placed too much trust in their own strength. The family had grown through both peace and war. Sarah had married Michael Mitchell and moved away from Deerfield, while Esther had married Ebenezer Smead and remained in the village. They were blessed with 4 beautiful daughters. Tragically, Elizabeth's husband, James Corse, had died, leaving her and her 2 sons and a daughter. They dwelled in a small cottage on her father's property. Mary gave Thomas 6 children, the last just newly born. Joseph had married Hannah Sheldon, who was with child. With an ever-growing number of grandchildren about them, John and Mary still had Jonathan, Ruth, and young John at home. The winter of 1704 was unusually cruel, and the snow lay deep about Deerfield. Drifts had risen nearly to the top of the wooden palisade, until the very wall raised for the village's protection offered a method to gain entry. Though the people had kept vigilant since the war began anew, few imagined that any raiding party could make the journey through such unnatural cold. Yet that is precisely what nearly 300 French soldiers, Canadian militia, with Huron and Abenaki warriors had done. They had come south through the winter wilderness, enduring cold and hunger to reach the settlement unseen. Before first light on the morning of the 29th, some of the raiders crept forward and climbed the great drifts piled against the palisade. With little difficulty they passed over the wall, opened the way for the others, and entered the sleeping village. The very snow Deerfield had trusted to keep an enemy away had betrayed them. The first warning for most in the village was the sound of musket fire, cries of alarm, and the splintering of doors, rousing Deerfield from its sleep. Windows were shuttered, and heavy bars dropped across doors as families hastened to secure their homes. At the French house, there was no time to resist. Thomas and Mary awoke to find the enemy already upon them, with 6 children beneath their roof, and their youngest scarcely a month old. Before Thomas could make any defense, the raiders had the entire family at knife point. While the family was being bound, an even greater horror followed. One of the raiders callously slew the newborn before his mother's eyes. The poor helpless thing was brained on the fireplace stone. Mary was overwhelmed by the horror. Soon, surviving neighbors were being brought to the French house, there to be bound and guarded while they awaited an unknown fate. Esther and Ebenezer Smead awoke to shouting and musket fire, with the enemy already inside the palisade. With 4 little girls, the youngest not yet 2, there could be no thought of making a stand. They quickly gathered the children and fled their home in the darkness, while houses began to burn and fighting raged around them. Only the Lord knows how they escaped. In such confusion, perhaps even they could not afterwards say. Joseph and his wife Hannah lived in the stoutly built house of his father-in-law, Benoni Stebbins. Neighbors had sought sanctuary in the stout stone home. For nearly 2 hours, the defenders held off the attackers. Hannah was wounded in the fighting, but survived. At last, the raiders abandoned their assault upon the house as the withdrawal from Deerfield began. When the alarm sounded, Elizabeth Corse determined to flee to her father's house with her 2 boys, James and Ebenezer, and her daughter, young Elizabeth. They had scarcely left the house when several raiders confronted them. Elizabeth bade the children run. The boys managed to slip away into the darkness, but mother and daughter were seized. They were led to the Sheldon house, where captives were being gathered and guarded. The attackers soon fell upon the Catlin house itself. Axes and musket stocks hammered against the barred door and shuttered windows. Other raiders clambered onto the roof, seeking some weaker place to break through. John and his sons Jonathan and young John seized their muskets and stood between the enemy and Mary and Ruth. Soon the raiders gained entrance through the broken timbers. The Catlin men fired one last volley before the fighting became hand-to-hand. The elder John and Jonathan fell soon after. The younger John was quickly overwhelmed and taken alive. Mary, Ruth, and young John were dragged from the house and taken to the Sheldon house with the other prisoners. Behind them, the Catlin home was set ablaze, with the bodies of John and Jonathan still inside. At the Sheldon house, the Catlin matriarch found daughter Elizabeth with her granddaughter, the younger Elizabeth. For one blessed moment, mother, daughters, and grandchild clung to one another, giving thanks to God that they had been spared. Then came the dreadful accounting. Mary told Elizabeth that John and Jonathan were dead. Elizabeth could give no comfort in return. Her sons Ebenezer and James had escaped, but she knew not whether they yet lived. Amid all that grief, Mary did something I have often struggled to understand. A young French officer lay badly wounded in the Sheldon house, crying out for water. Mary had seen her husband and son killed scarcely an hour before, yet she did not turn away from him. She carried him a cup of cold water and knelt beside the dying man while he drank. Perhaps she saw only the face of her own slain son. Whatever passed through her heart, she chose compassion when bitterness would have been the more natural course. The officer gave Mary a grateful look and quietly breathed his last. Another French officer had witnessed her kindness and regarded her thoughtfully as the first light of morning broke over the village. Soon they were ordered to their feet, and the soldiers began binding the prisoners together for the march. Then a French officer stepped forward and pointed to Mary. Because of the mercy she had shown the dying officer, she was to be left behind. Mary begged them to spare her children and granddaughter as well, but her pleas went unanswered. Mary was permitted to follow them outside as the captives were gathered for departure. There, among the prisoners, she suddenly saw her daughter, Mary French, with her husband Thomas and 5 of their children. For an instant her heart must have lifted at the sight of them alive, but a cold dread seized her when she noted that the younger Mary's infant was not among them. Before she could reach them or learn what had happened, the prisoners were driven onward. Mary could only stand and watch as 11 members of her family were led away from Deerfield. At the Stebbins house, the wounded were being tended. Through the shutters, the survivors could see the captives gathering upon the main road. Joseph and the other able-bodied men wrestled with a dreadful choice. With so few among them, the prospect of overtaking the retreating column and freeing the captives seemed hopeless. Yet how could they abandon their neighbors and kinsmen to their fate? And if they sacrificed themselves in a fruitless pursuit, those who remained in Deerfield would be left defenseless. As the raiders withdrew from Deerfield with their captives, those who remained watched helplessly from the surviving houses. Before long, militia began arriving from Hadley, Hatfield, and the neighboring settlements. More than 50 armed men came to Deerfield. Joined by a handful of men from the village, the small force set out after the retreating enemy. Among them was Joseph Catlin. They had scarcely reached the meadows beyond the village when the trap was sprung. French and native warriors who had remained behind opened fire from concealment, then fell upon the pursuers. The little force was badly outnumbered. 1 man was captured, many were wounded, and 9 were killed, including Joseph Catlin. The raiders harried the survivors as they fought their way back toward Deerfield. There would be no second pursuit. The remaining militia had learned at bitter cost that their numbers were far too few to prevail. There was no time for mourning. The wounded must be tended, the dead looked after, fires quenched, and food found among the ruins. The militia from the neighboring towns proved invaluable in these labors. As daylight waned, many neighbor militiamen began returning to their own homes. Those with surviving kin in Deerfield took their relations with them, offering shelter from the bitter cold and the ruin left behind. The survivors of the Catlin clan gathered at the empty French home, one of the few houses within the stockade left unburned. Present were the matriarch Mary Catlin, her daughter Esther, and son-in-law Ebenezer, with their young daughters Esther, Elizabeth, Thankful, and Ruth, her daughter-in-law Hannah, and her grandsons James and Ebenezer Corse. As the evening meal was prepared, the shock of the morning gave way to grief, as each began to reckon their losses. The butcher's bill was frightful. 100 souls had been lost. Among them were Mary's husband John and her son Jonathan, slain and consumed in the flames of their burning house, son Joseph killed and scalped in the fight in the meadow, and perhaps most terrible of all, her infant grandson John, dashed against the stone hearth in the very room where they now gathered. More than 100 souls had been taken captive. Those who remained knew not what fate awaited their kin and could only imagine the worst. Torture was common among the Indians, and even cannibalism was not unheard of. Young women might be taken as wives, and children adopted among the heathen tribes, never to return to their families. We prayed that our kin might instead be held for ransom and restored to us, as had sometimes been the case. Of the Catlin clan, Mary's son John and daughter Ruth had been taken. Her daughter Elizabeth Corse and granddaughter, young Elizabeth, were likewise made captive. Most grievously afflicted was the family of her daughter Mary French and husband Thomas, who were carried away with their 5 children: young Mary, young Thomas, Freedom, Martha, and Abigail. The elder, Mary Catlin, survived the terrible morning, but the ordeal had exacted a fearful toll. Her husband and 2 sons were dead, 4 children and 7 grandchildren had been carried to unknown fate, and her home of 20 years lay in ashes. Whether due to privation or overwhelming grief, her strength soon failed her. In less than 2 months after the raid, the Lord gathered Mary home. She was 64 years old. For the captives, the suffering had scarcely begun. More than 100 men, women, and children were driven north through deep snow toward Canada, poorly clothed and with little food. Those who could not keep the pace were killed to avoid risking the raiders to counterattack. Before the journey was ended, 19 captives had been slain along the way. 2 more died of hunger and exhaustion, while 2 managed to escape. Mary French, still weak from her recent childbirth, was unequal to the task. She was tomahawked and scalped in front of her husband and children. Her body was left without ceremony at the side of the trail. Her sister Elizabeth Corse was also slain before reaching Canada, receiving the same treatment as a warning to the others to not impede the progress of the column. Four of our kin would never return to New England. Young Elizabeth Corse remained in Quebec and embraced their Catholic faith. She married and raised a family there, Freedom. French likewise married and made her life among the French. Martha French passed for a time among the Indians before coming into the care of Catholic sisters, who found a suitable husband for her. Abigail French was adopted among the Mohawk at Kahnawake and remained with them for the rest of her life. 5 of our kin were eventually redeemed and returned to New England. John Catlin and his sister Ruth came home, as did Thomas French and his children Mary and young Thomas. Their captivity had lasted years before being successfully ransomed. Mary married a man from Northampton. Ruth soon left Deerfield and the family lost track of her. Both Thomas Sr. and Jr. married and made lives in Deerfield. Elizabeth Corse's sons also left Deerfield behind. James settled at Wallingford, Connecticut, while Ebenezer made his home at Northampton and took up the cooper's trade. Esther and Ebenezer Schmitt never left Deerfield. They remained upon the ground where they had survived that terrible morning, raised a large family, and helped rebuild the settlement around them. Hannah, widowed by Joseph Catlin's heroic death, moved downriver to Northampton, Massachusetts, where she delivered John Catlin. Before the year was out, she married Nathaniel Clark and began her life anew. John, in his turn, started a whole new branch of Catlin Cousins. And of course, cousin John Catlin, whose home we soon visit. He has lived in Deerfield ever since he returned from Quebec. He married, raised 12 children, upon the same ground where his father and brother had perished and the family home had burned. I had heard some stories often enough, Father, yet I never knew the half of it. So many of our kin lost in a single night, and those who survived to endure all that followed and yet carry on. What courage! I scarce know how they found the strength. You speak true, son. It is a hard tale, but no harder than the truth of it. I have told it as near as I am able, just as it was told to me by those who knew what befell them. Be sure that the tale lives in the minds and hearts of your children and grandchildren. The story deserves to live with our family until Judgment Day.